I'm Tom Ashbrook. This is On Point, and we're talking this hour about climate change, sea level rise, and a new focus on managed retreat from American and global coasts. Who may go where and how and when as the U.S. backs away from measures to fight climate change? Could you imagine your community in a managed retreat from climate-driven sea rise? How do you picture our coastal communities, cities, 50 or 100 years from now, floating like Venice or walled like Holland, in a bowl like New Orleans? Gone? Joining me now from California is Miyuki Hino, PhD student at Stanford University, lead author of a paper published Monday in the science journal Nature Climate Change titled Managed Retreat as a Response to the Natural Hazard Risk. A lot of people thinking about climate change. You're looking at managed retreat. How widely within the United States and globally do you think this is going to be something that communities have to consider?
We're still learning about how to do managed retreat, about what it means to adapt to climate change and where we're going to pursue different options. We really set out in our study to try to understand how managed retreat fits into a range of adaptation options that we have for the future as we're looking at sea levels rising, more communities facing more frequent flooding, risks from erosion and hurricanes. And we found that this is, in fact, already happening all over the world. We have many communities in the U.S. that have responded in some way by moving out of the way of floods or hurricanes, and that's very similar to what we see in Europe, in South Asia, in East Asia, Australia, even in Pacific Islands.
How does a community begin to think about this?
There's no question that even considering managed retreat is really tough and really complex, particularly so because there are such high intangible costs. But we do find that there are communities out there thinking that it is the best option for them. And in some cases, some people might find that there are better job opportunities somewhere else, and their financial or their economic context might improve if they move. For other communities, a planned relocation effort is one way for them to stay close to their neighbors and to preserve the social networks that they have. And in other situations, by moving out of the way, communities are able to restore coastal ecosystems and beaches to their former state. So we see a lot of different reasons why different communities are pursuing managed retreat, but it's clear that it's never easy. We find different settings everywhere we look. I think the best way to think about managed retreat decision-making is as a negotiation between different groups. Two of the key groups involved are, of course, the residents, the people on the ground that are confronting the risks, and often the other group is a government agency at some level that's going to make the move happen. In some cases, the push to relocate is really from the government agency side, and it may not be the first option that the residents would like to pursue. We also see the exact opposite situation where the residents are the ones pushing for relocation and they may or may not be getting the support from government to do so. The local governments and the federal government may not have their incentives aligned in the same way, and that's a huge challenge for managed retreat. It might encourage local governments and people in those places to develop and reside in really hazard-prone areas, but ultimately it might be the federal government that's responsible for footing the bill when the disaster comes through. So in the future, aligning those incentives is going to be really important to making this happen more smoothly.
If things really get tough, is the U.S. set up with government agencies to see who should stay and who should go as seas rise? How does this decision get made?
The U.S. does not have a formalized system in place for making decisions about which communities are best suited to which adaptation options. As society, we've never faced a situation like this before where we know that the future isn't going to look like the past, but we don't know exactly what to prepare for and how to prepare.
The last century, seas rose something like 5 inches globally. This century, several feet of sea rise are projected, more or less depending on how we respond. One analysis saying there could be as many as 470 million people globally whose homes would eventually be submerged. That's a lot of people on the move. What's the range of community sizes that you looked at in your survey?
We do see small villages, whether that's in Alaska or in the Pacific Islands, where it's dozens, maybe 100 people that are trying to relocate or relocating. But often in the wake of major disasters, we see hundreds of thousands of people moving at once. For instance, after Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, the government decided that within a certain distance of the coast, it would be better not to rebuild. And an estimated million people were going to have to move as a result of that. There will be people moving in a changing climate. The question is how that move happens. And managed retreat is one way of trying to coordinate and plan that move strategically so that we can best meet our collective goals while doing so. The most common way that we do managed retreat in the United States is after a big hurricane or a flood takes place. The Federal Emergency Management Agency will come in and offer certain houses buyouts. And what that means is they will offer the homeowner some amount of money, and if the homeowner accepts, the government will buy your house, take down the property, and just restore it to open space. And FEMA tends to target houses that are likely to be damaged again in future disasters. And they do that because it will save taxpayers money in the long term if we don't have to worry about disaster relief and recovery for that property. We think that about 100,000 people have been bought out through this process since the early 1980s. And that's one of the big tools that the U.S. has at its disposal.
Dean in Hyde Park, Massachusetts.
In certain coastal communities in the United States and abroad, you have high-rise hotels within less than 50 feet of the tide line. You see this in Florida. And the amount of high-rise luxury hotel and apartment buildings that are built right on these barrier islands, this sort of short-term profit is if climate change and sea level rise didn't exist. What will it take to tip the balance? Is it going to be some kind of massive natural disaster?
What is it that gets people thinking another way, maybe not sinking a foundation here, but pulling up stakes and moving inland?
We're right at the start of seeing these dramatic changes in sea level and the impacts that they might have. In Miami Beach in Florida, the frequency of flooding has gotten so high that they've mobilized about $400 million to install pumps, to raise roads, to do everything that they need to do infrastructure-wise to keep their community resilient and safe. That's one way of going about it. There's insurance and how we price risk for people that are living in these really hazardous locations that can also change the calculus for individual homeowners in those places. There are a lot of different reasons why someone might come to the idea that the settings are right for them to move instead for them to anchor down in place. Real estate markets are one key signal for that. As soon as property values start going down, you might see people moving. But certainly managed retreat is not a tool that we currently have in our adaptation toolkit. So to the extent that we change the development incentives and policies so that we can really consider it in the places where it makes sense, the better off we'll be in the future.
I want to go to Alaska for a minute, if I may. Anchorage, Alaska, and Robin Bronin, Senior Research Scientist at the Institute of Arctic Biology at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. She studies rising sea levels, disappearing ice, melting permafrost, how all that affects communities. Is Alaska tasting this future already?
Yes, we've been actually facing it for the last couple of decades.
And are you engaged in managed retreat, watching communities actually leave the coastline?
Yes. In 2009, the federal government did a report on Alaska Native villages that were imminently threatened by flooding and erosion. And at that time, they found 12 communities in Alaska were making the decision to relocate as their best long-term adaptation strategy. What I've learned in the past decade of following the relocation issues in Alaska, which gets to your previous questions, is the challenge in the United States and really all over the world is we do not have what I call a governance framework to address the need to relocate populations prior to an extreme weather event happening. The way that most of the managed retreats happen is that most of the relief happens after an extreme weather event. That's when the financing becomes available. And to facilitate a relocation or managed retreat when there is not an extreme weather event, when it is, for instance, erosion causing land to permanently disappear, we have no institutional mechanism to make that possible. So no community has yet relocated. That's really important to know because of this lack of a governance framework. And the largest community that is seeking to relocate is a population of about 1,000 people.
What's happening to their community?
We have had record low extents of Arctic sea ice, and Arctic sea ice used to be a natural barrier along the coastlines of Alaska. And without that barrier, when storms come in that are as strong as hurricanes, that barrier isn't there, and it's causing accelerated rates of erosion because the land is also permafrost, which is permanently frozen ground in the northwest part of Alaska, is melting. So the erosion is accelerating and damaging and destroying the infrastructure and dwellings in these communities.
Ben Strauss joins us right now from Princeton, New Jersey, ecologist, evolutionary biologist. He's VP for Sea Level and Climate Impacts at Climate Central. How much of the United States' lower 48 coast may be impacted in such a way that it will end up considering managed retreat?
Eventually, pretty much all of it. We've really changed from a world in which sea level was stable to one in which it's going to be rising
for hundreds of years.
And we're at the beginning of that time. Eventually, almost every place is going to be affected, but the first places are going to be South Florida and Louisiana, and some spots around the Chesapeake Bay. South Florida has the biggest population.
Eventually, almost every place is going to be affected. We're at the beginning of that time.
Depending on how much more carbon we put in the atmosphere and how sensitive climate and sea level turns out to be to that carbon, how lucky we are, really, South Florida may lose its viability as a place to live later in this century. And it will be impossible to defend there, really, in the long run, because the bedrock is like Swiss cheese. It's full of holes. So you can't really build a levee to keep the sea out. The mainstream scientific feeling has been that we might see 2 or 3 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century, on average, globally. That is already going to be pretty tough to swallow for South Florida, but will be manageable in most places. But now we see a much higher end extreme sea level scenario that's possible. A new NOAA technical report was released this January suggesting that we could see 10 feet or more this century around U.S. shores.
10 feet or more this century around U.S. shores.
It is a dramatic shift, and the reason for that possibility of the larger scenario is Antarctica. Until recently, most scientific projections of sea level rise predicted that there would be almost no contribution from Antarctica this century. But new research that came out a year ago pointed to a very strong possibility the West Antarctic ice sheet could destabilize this century. That makes the difference. That's something that we really want to minimize the chances of happening. In that report, we double the chances of that happening by staying on a dirty energy path. And the United States today is the world's second largest emitter. I think that is very important to realize that sea level is rising everywhere, and not every community has the same amount of resources, and this will be a huge equity issue. So Miami Beach is spending $500 million that they've taxed themselves to fix it. Atlantic City, same size, Barrier Island, same kind of threat, is just falling apart.
Clinton, Illinois, Anne is calling.
New York City. That's a different type of community than small Alaskan villages.
Okay, there's a city that's right on the water. Do the lessons you see in smaller cities apply to big ones?
Managed retreat is not going to be the answer for everyone. But even in New York, after Hurricane Sandy, there were certain communities on Staten Island that really pushed for the federal government to support them with buyouts. One in particular, Oakwood Beach on Staten Island, over half of the neighborhood there agreed to be bought out and for that land to be restored to open space. And I think this idea of combining all of the different options that we have available to us, whether that's building levees in certain locations, retreating in other locations, and reinforcing infrastructure in others, that's the type of mindset that we should be using to adapt to climate change in the future. And it's going to be a different mix in different places, but having all of those options on the table is really important.
I'm originally from New York and was there when Hurricane Sandy happened, so I've been following New York City's decisions in regard to how they are going to protect themselves from sea level rise. And it's a really difficult question to answer because, as you know, Manhattan is an island. And so how high do you build those seawalls to deal with the fact that we are warming our climate at an unprecedented place. And if we can't build those seawalls high enough, then for certain, lower Manhattan is going underwater. And so from the perspective of doing the work that I've done in Alaska, it is urgent that we figure out a governance framework so that people aren't in crisis and that we can actually have a managed retreat before there's another hurricane that comes and displaces millions of people.
Janine in Mandeville, Louisiana.
I'm a citizen that lives on the coast, on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain, taking part in a series of public hearings in Louisiana right now, which are dedicated to giving us a comprehensive master plan for a sustainable coast. Your experts have correctly said that Louisiana is going to be one of the places that's the most severely affected by sea level rise.
We saw what happened after Katrina with New Orleans and the coastline there. Are people in your neck of the woods talking about hunkering down, putting up higher walls, or potentially moving, Janine?
Both. And that's what this series of meetings is about. When you experience many, what they call severe repetitive losses from flooding, then there's just no way that you can continue that. We really need to have a comprehensive program that gives many options for what the people can do here. We have seen some communities far south on the coast already have to relocate. They're just not viable anymore. And we had a peculiar problem here, which was the BP oil spill several years ago.
Sure.
It accelerated our erosion losses tremendously.
And some have had to go.
Yes, there's a community on Ile de Jean Charles in southern Louisiana that recently was awarded federal money to relocate, and that process is underway now. In some ways, it is a great model for how we might be able to keep communities intact and also get a lot more local support and local buy-in and local control over relocation outcomes. At the same time, this is going to be happening in more places, whether that's in Alaska, Louisiana, South Florida in the future. And we certainly don't have a systematic way of allocating money to different adaptation options in different places.
Ethan in Saco, Maine.
Where is there any data on how much sea levels are rising now? I haven't seen a lot of sea level rise. My mother lives in Florida. She said that the seawater is getting into the springs down there, which is an issue. But is there any data about the actual increases that are happening now? I know you're talking about projections and stuff, but What's going on now?
We, in fact, are measuring sea level rise that's happening right now. NOAA has an extensive network of tide gauges that have been taking data, some for more than 100 years, that show a very clear rise in sea level all around the United States. Different parts are rising at different rates. We also, since the early 90s, have evidence from satellites covering the whole global surface of the ocean that sea level is rising and has been accelerating recently. Sometimes it's hard to see it at a specific location, but along the coast of Maine, actually, sea level is rising around 2 millimeters a year. And that's going to be hard to see. An inch every decade, it's not rising as fast as some other places.
And if it goes to a 2 or 3 foot rise in this century, or the 10 foot plus sort of nightmare scenario, what's the curve on that look like?
It's definitely an acceleration, mild acceleration for the next few decades. In the really extreme sea level scenario, there would be a sharp acceleration in the second half of the century when Antarctic decay really kicks in.
Let's go to Tom in Baltimore.
Besides residential relocation, many infrastructures, such as municipal sewage plants and old hazardous waste landfills, are built right on the water. And when the sea level rises and it gets into those areas, they'll have to be moved at great expense. Also, things like hazardous waste landfills, you can't really move them. But as the sea level rises, it's going to intrude into that stuff, leach that material out and get it into the water. I don't know what people are going to do about that.
Yeah, it's not just loading the trunk of the car and everybody driving off. How does infrastructure figure in when managed retreat comes to look like the best option?
We do have power plants, landfills, wastewater treatment plants of all kinds along the coast. In fact, we do see public agencies taking measures on their own land to relocate those things. For instance, there have been lighthouses, which obviously are very exposed to sea level rise, that have been moved a couple hundred yards or something like that inland. There will be costs that public agencies have to bear to figure out what to do about those power plants, those landfills, and so forth. But I think the added complexity of residential relocation, people moving, makes it a really different type of challenge than the challenge of finding new places and finding the money to move infrastructure.
Riskfinder.org could be useful for the caller and listeners. You can look up how much stuff is under different sea level rise increments all over the United States. For example, in New Jersey, there are more than 1,000 EPA-certified hazardous waste sites less than 5 feet above the high tide line, and 2,000 within 10 feet. So the caller is absolutely right. We have a tremendous amount of stuff that we don't want to get wet in the lowest elevations.
Get one more call here. Nancy in Jonesboro, Maine.
I'm an organic farmer right on the Atlantic Ocean, only a few hundred yards from Route 1, and I can tell you that this is U.S. Route 1. It occasionally floods here in town, but one solution that I propose is that we demand our elected officials face up that we must stop burning fossil fuels, and new activists, please run for office. We are in for chaos. The ocean is creeping up into my apple trees. This is happening. There's empirical evidence out there for anybody who wants to see it. I'm in Maine, and we have all kinds of progressives and radicals getting really, really angry. This is all over the country. Just look up the word indivisible, and you'll find there are 10,000 groups of progressives and new activists all over the country.
I'm Tom Ashbrook. This is On Point.